Israel's Supreme Court just struck down a law that would have limited its own powers. Now, the move sparked nationwide protests. Here to discuss what this means for Israel and how it could impact the war with Hamas is Rabbi Stephen Pruzansky, the chairman of the Coalition for Jewish Values in Israel.
The Supreme Court several years ago arrogated to itself the right to invalidate Knesset legislation passed by majorities in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, simply on the basis that the Supreme Court felt the law was unreasonable, and without having to give any other reason, which makes their decisions completely arbitrary. Well, the Knesset passed a law several months ago, essentially limiting the Supreme Court's right to invalidate that legislation on that basis, meaning the Supreme Court has the right, like any judiciary does, to invalidate laws if it conflicts with another law or violates some clause in Israel's unwritten constitution, which are the basic laws of Israel. But no court should have the right to invalidate a law simply because it doesn't like it. Its policy preferences are otherwise. When it does that, it makes itself into a super legislature, which essentially then vitiates the importance of any vote that the public has. So it's inherently an anti-democratic act, with the bitter irony is that the court claims it's doing this in order to preserve democracy.
Now, can we go in a little bit deeper here and discuss the underlying causes of this controversy with this law, the Supreme Court, and Netanyahu?
Yes, it actually does not really relate directly to the prime minister, as since this legislation has been in the hopper for many years already. It's just an attempt to limit the court's powers. The court never exercised its power over laws until about 30 years ago, when Aharon Barak became the Chief Justice, and he essentially spearheaded a judicial revolution, which tried and succeeded in making the Supreme Court of Israel not just the arbiter of law, but arbiter of all policies that the government enacts. So the Supreme Court in Israel does not operate based on any requirements of standing, such as exists in America. They get involved in religious legislation, who is defined as a Jew, where roads can be built, what type of food is served to prisoners, and most importantly, in today's context, what the Israeli army can or cannot do. So a few years ago, for example, Israel's army had declared the area around Gaza right up to the border fence an area that essentially is a kill zone, that any person who enters that area is subject to immediate arrest, or if threatened, a soldier could shoot him. Well, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that invalid and said that the Gazans have the right to approach the fence without having any reaction on the part of Israel's army. And we now know the devastating effect that had on October 7th. And the question is, who gave the Supreme Court the right to adjudicate every single issue on every aspect of society, whether law or policy? That is what underlies the reasonableness clause. It's an attempt to constrain the court, which operates now as a quasi-dictatorship.
Now, with the recent strike down of this law here, how is that going to impact the war going forward?
In the short term, I think it sows disunity into the Israeli public. And the disunity was a crisis that led up to the outbreak of war. Since the war, the country has been united, left to right, center, religious, secular. Everyone has joined together in the war effort because we see that what unites us is much more prevalent and important than what divides us. And now the Supreme Court has chosen this moment in time once again to engender disunity and disharmony into the Israeli body politic. So rather than focus on winning the war, which, by the way, the Israeli Supreme Court is a majority leftist, I'm not sure they want Israel to win the war. But now that we're engaged in this conflict, once again, they're weakening the society from within. It's as if they're completely disconnected from the ordinary citizen, and they are. They don't trust democracy. That really is the problem. They don't trust the votes of the people, so they maintain themselves as a sort of super legislature, super prime minister, that every piece of legislation, every policy that's not even legislation, has to pass muster with them. That is unprecedented in any democracy in the world.
Well, thank you very much for that insight there. Rabbi Stephen Pruzansky, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Jack.